Muscle endurance is a big part of the training that goes into the expertise of mixed modal. It is a large chapter within mixed modal digital education, and the reason for that is two things. Number one, we've just classified it as something that's really important to the sport, and secondly, it's something that is not only important to the sport, but really it's the base support of a lot of capacity moving forward for individuals. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes discussing some of the bigger points of muscle endurance. First of all, just allowing you to think about a concept of muscle endurance or what it really means. For mixed modal and the sport, it's the goal is to reach the highest level of physical expression in maximal contractions or in sustainable activities with a dynamic atmosphere. That sounds like just two easy things, right? Well, there's a lot in that. And in large part, it's not about just expressing oneself effectively as best as possible one time, because in most cases, whatever a competitive setting means, it means you got to do it a number of times a year and a number of times over a weekend. So a big part that has to play with the key ingredient that allows people to have more capacity than others is essentially taking contractions and moving them further out to the right, making them more sustainable than others. The best for yourself, but also more sustainable than others. And in this, what we're calling it, just for today, is I'm reducing it down to just calling it muscle endurance. And if you want to think about it, essentially what you're trying to do is, like I like to say, we're trying to make contractions as aerobic as possible. Now, the way you want to think about it is that is unnatural. It's almost unnatural depending upon who you're working with. Because if you want to think about putting a dumbbell in your hand and doing a bicep curl, there's going to come a point in time for numerous different reasons it's going to stop. Okay? Now, you want to say to yourself, although it's a really tough brain stretch, how could I extend that bicep curl out for 7 minutes? Okay? Now I know it's imposing an isolation idea on a specific muscle, and I know it's imposing also a real big challenge to the fundamental belief around biology, but that's in essence what we have to strive towards to improve capacity. Now we know there's a number of other movements involved. It's not just one specific movement and fatigue that can occur with that. There's a bunch of different movements involved, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. So you can see that in order to move it out to the right, the person and the athlete has to have some form of pace, sustainable mentality, whether that is derived from a self-organization that's better than others, from experience, from et cetera, they have to have that. So I like to call it, in words, a dampening effect. So they have to know just how to do the right amount of contracting and intent to move as far to the right as possible to establish this sustainability muscle endurance. Secondly, you have to be concerned around the muscles that are used and the patterns of movement, because some muscles, head to toe, whether we like it or not, have a faster rate of fatigue than others. Third, and there's a number of other things, but third, we got to think about load, because load can create specific occlusions or also motor unit fatigue at a certain movement or muscle that just does not allow actual extension of endurance. So load does have a part to play in that, but it still doesn't disregard the fact that mixed modal muscle endurance is essentially trying to move all that stuff to the right. And why is this important? Well, I've said it already, but it acts as a base support really for what's currently prescribed as competitive fitness tests. It's the base support that's needed to raise, not only raise levels of capacity, I should back up on that, but to really act as a base support so that people can achieve the highest levels of capacity. Now it sounds kind of simple. Well, I just pace better and I ensure I know the kind of movements to pace better and I kind of watch for load. Yeah, that's fundamentally what you have to look for, but there's a number of other factors that come with that. Very quickly, what are those factors? you gotta have a certain kind of strength and motor control and repetition of all those movements so that you can actually, intend on doing the contraction as effectively as possible to the right. You of course have to have the right mindset and intent, because that will indicate, certain levels of arousal will indicate what you're gonna do with those movements. You have to have a certain level of resilience and speed of adaptation, because if you have a poor adaptation, you get a new movement and a new muscle group and you don't know how to meander around that, it will result in you doing an incorrect pace for that muscle endurance pattern, right? So there's lots of really powerful reasons behind understanding muscle endurance as it applies to mixed modal, as well as how to train it. A few other points on it. Why the variety of the movement? And this is probably not a question you've been asking, but I should say, well, why do you have to provide a lot of variety in patterns of movements and movements when you train mixed modal muscle endurance? And the reason for that is that the sport dictates you being able to move all kinds of contractions, all of them, isometric, dynamic, eccentric, whatever the case may be. You want to move all of them towards a more sustainable method. You don't want to train to be unsustainable, ironically, because that's what your body's going to learn how to do, how to do that process. It doesn't mean you're going to get into some unsustainable methods, but you want to be able to train it to move it out, and that has to occur in all different patterns. It's not like it's just a squat, upper pull dominated sport. There's all different kinds of patterns, single leg patterns, bending patterns, and those are not just done for a 1RM. There's not one 1RM test for a lunge. So the question has to be, well then, why should I do lunges and how does it apply to the sport? Well, you probably want to do them to develop right to left strength and also to maybe get stronger in some lower body activities for that important maximal contraction I was talking about. But you could have to do various different kinds of single leg activity and sustain at it. And you need to have that muscle endurance. And you can't just learn how to go 100 feet with a weight over your head by just getting stronger. If that's the first time you've learned that, well, now you know. You actually have to train it in a process. And it has to be done with multiple different patterns of movement. So if you don't know what those are, I'll just ask you to do your own research to look at the sporting movements and what's inside of it, and then say, well, essentially I have to, try to develop muscle endurance in all those patterns. I'll break them down into 6. Those are just primal patterns that are used day to day in strength, but ironically they are involved in mixed modal. Bending patterns, squatting patterns, lunging patterns, upper pushing patterns, upper pulling patterns, and bracing, rotation, flexion, extension. So just think of it as core patterns. And if you were to now think, well, how do I apply muscle endurance to move forward? You would first want to think that, am I applying all the variances insides of the patterns and how they're put in place, okay? And then when you put them together, which is included in our mixed modal digital course extensively as to how to organize that, you have to be thinking about how each of those patterns and movements in a training set or training session are all going to react with one another. Because in every movement, I'll just give you 2 specific examples. A ring muscle up and extended walking lunges with load. There could be some people who are really good at extending muscle endurance over the ring muscle up and not so good with the single leg activity for different reasons. Experience, position, load, motor units, etc., etc. Could be some people who are really good at muscle endurance for the lower body and not so good at extended muscle endurance for the ring muscle up. So you can see that there has to be an organizational strategy as to where they apply in fatigue, non-fatigue settings, how these things work together. So I'm just going to leave you with that to think about how you put them together if you're trying to actually put all these movement patterns together to create muscle endurance. And the thing that's slightly different from muscle endurance, so we don't just all classify as all work from muscle endurance, because it essentially really is, but what we're talking about is that middle zone of reference of grinding and using muscles. As I said, use the bicep curl idea. We're trying to move that to the right. So I'm not saying that rowing's not inside of it, running's not inside of it, etc. And I'm not saying some kind of heavier contractions are not inside of it, but I'm trying to find that middle zone of muscle endurance that we're discussing. So it leaves out only cyclical activity, and it leaves out only really challenging contractions, and we get that middle zone of those moderate to lower load resistance style activities, body weight style activities in different forms of contractions that we essentially have to move further and further out to the right. What it looks like in testing could be anything. You've probably seen something like this in a testing atmosphere for time, this big, honkin' 100 push press, 100 overhead squat, 100 chest to bar, 100 box jump, step down, as an example, right? Lots of reps, really long, but what's essentially inside of it is a number of things that dictate success, but that would be the testing for an aspect of muscle endurance. Now, why we do it and et cetera, that's for another conversation, but you can see that you have to have an element of muscle endurance. Why? Because you essentially want to sustain as best as possible for as long as possible through this entire sequence with multiple different patterns. It's a squat jump pattern, squatting pattern, pulling spinal flexion extension pattern, and a hip extension pattern, right? So if you have to go through that, you don't want to be thinking about it as approaching it, well, I'm just going to work hard and go all out and then allow things to work out the way they do. That may work for 2% of the individuals who can self-organize effectively, what's essentially inside their pacing anyways, but they just don't know how to talk about it. For the 98% others, they're going to have to train muscle endurance. Now, training muscle endurance will be different than this. Just to give you an idea what the training of it versus testing would be. Training of it essentially, just to give you one perspective of the difference in training versus testing. In testing, we really don't know what's going to happen. Well, we always want to set people up for success in testing, knowing that we've built those physical fitness characteristics to get to the test, to get some confidence, to know there's some improvements. But sometimes testing is also used kind of litmus as to let's see how we're going. So the main difference between a test and training is with training, it's controlled. You know exactly where individuals sit, and you know why you're doing what you're doing in the ordering and the pattern of that. But essentially, using our previous test, training of muscle endurance may look like this. 15 push press unbroken. What were the exercises again? Oh yeah, 15 overhead squat with the same barbell. Just say that within the test, just use, for example, to compare it to is the same. 15 chest to bar unbroken, and then 15 box jump step down, and we give some kind of pace and score to that. So they're going to do that 5 times. A whole other time I'll talk about like why 5 times, why the rest period, et cetera, but let's just think of the testing piece of it. So do all that in order, and we're going to give them 2 minutes rest. So as I said, why 2 minutes rest? Well, it's in large part connected to how much time it might take, and then I want to make it repeatable for them to train the aspects of it. But what you're going to glean from this is that that's the training of muscle endurance in various different styles of contractions. Again, mixed modal digital education will give you an idea as to like what kind of contractions you should train first, why should you have sustainability, what kind of volume is needed, et cetera, to get towards moving all these contractions towards a sporting environment. So that would be a training version now that you've seen the testing aspect of it. And again, I just want to remind you that it's not only muscle endurance that's inside this that you're improving, but it gives an example of what muscle endurance would be. Okay? And lastly, the science behind it, as I mentioned earlier, is not there. There's not a lot of labs that are calling me up saying, oh, I think this is the secret ingredient to less pharmaceutical drugs and decreased chances of heart disease. And that essentially is how you're going to derive some kind of research on it. Secondly, it's very unnatural. I mean, why would you want to move muscle endurance? How is that functional to anything really besides just the sport? There's a number of different reasons, but we are the data. The practice of what we've been doing for a decade is the data on it. And so we have to use only that, unfortunately, observation and empirical data to say that these are the things that are necessary as key performance indicators that dictate success in the sport. It's the training of muscle endurance effectively to act as the base support to improve capacity in the current testing environment today. So for the scientific aspects of it, it's really hard to to find some testing being as unnatural as it is. And all we can really look at are different, theories and models on fatigue, as well as have a good understanding of the base physiological, not really arguments, but conversations on what essentially causes fatigue in motor units when there's activity in that motor unit with different loads and movements. So we can only use those as models to kind of look at, say, what makes people tired after 5 minutes of bicep curls? And, if you're not asking that question because it's like it sounds stupid, well, essentially you're moving your head away from what actually needs to happen in order for people to improve muscle endurance within the sport of mixed modal. So science will take a lot of time because of the aspect of it is so broad and varied, and it's very unnatural, but that should be a beacon of what we actually should look towards trying to improve, is to go beyond those physical capabilities of extending these pieces of muscle endurance out and of essentially, which sounds crazy, but trying to make dynamic contractions as aerobic as possible for as long as possible. And I think that, plus a number of other things, but this is one of the key points that need to be investigated in training process, as well as to be used as an assessment tool, and to put people in lane as to where they start on their progression. And we unfold this, of course, in the Mixed Modal digital course, which I look forward to having you go through, and you can get more information on mixed modal muscle endurance.